So, so where are we today? Hello. That's right. I was going to send link. Now, where are you? There we go. And okay, here we go. So where are we? So we've got two models, essentially. We've got, I wanted to name this a bit more. We've got I kind of wanted to name this entities, each of these four parts. So we've got entity of culture, the entity of individuals, the entity of systems, and the entity of material. So should we reiterate that? Probably. And then I feel like by my next stream, I'm going to redo this in a more streamlined, compact, and direct way. So that's our one model of what do we call it? Entities, where we talk about, the constitution of each of these entities and how we consider them. Well, I'm going to have to stop that, aren't I? Where is that even coming from? I don't know. Just mute the app. Okay. So back at it. So we've got that model, and we're going to have to redo some of this. A lot of this is filled with Plato that I find ridiculous. From Plato's Republic. I think it's a bad constitution of the entities, essentially. I think culture is an important entity to consider in the mix. I don't think quite often it is considered, and I think that's quite bad. So that is something to think about there. So this whole section is, Plato's Republic. We've got, except for this, actually. Let's divide that out because that's kind of interesting. And not Platonic, you could say. It's Hobbes and Rousseau, I believe. Rousseau being positive rights and Hobbes being negative rights with privileges to consider this sort of area that positive rights can kind of lead to. So that's where that is. So this whole section in here is Plato talking about the noble lie that the philosopher king and is a row below the philosopher king, which is kind of an aristocracy. Well, not really. It's the elite, essentially the intellectual elite. But they know the noble lie, or the plebeians underneath at the bottom rungs, the actual workers of the society, they are being told to believe the noble lie that's that people are born with a certain capability, where they've got gold in their heart or silver or down to bronze or iron, essentially. And so there'll be trials, and then you can figure out which one you are, and that's what rung of the society you are in. And so all the people that get sorted into the bottom rung are being, it seems, are the ones that don't know the noble lie is a lie, essentially. And the truth of the matter is that it's a way of sorting intelligence, essentially, is what the hope is. That by sorting the intelligence, they can limit the breeding of certain layers, which is kind of disgusting to think about. But and essentially form no family units, but community within each bracket of society. And community raising, which sounds good, but not having anyone particular. So it's interesting because there doesn't seem to be an institution for looking after kids or a sort of manifestation of how that'll work alongside people, essentially. Like, I know it's probably actually not much of a factor, but I know when we have apprentices at work, being an electrician, essentially you have to have one person training them, if they're first year and they don't know anything. But so you have to devote one worker to do that. So essentially, by adding a worker, you've gone half worker for essentially almost 2 years. So that will decrease the efficiency of a layer for a while, and probably perpetually in more doing so. For one, there's a lot more infancy essentially you're going to have to deal with, as opposed to already someone who's capable of doing work but just doesn't know how. So that'll be interesting how each of those brackets work out. It seems like a community will form devoted to the running of or looking after the kids within each of the brackets. Is probably the way that'll go. But there's not much consideration for that in Plato's Republic. Is just, oh yes, seems good, let's do it that way. Plus they want to, it seems like they just want to sleep with a whole lot of people, so that seems to be, there's no family units, it's just the whole strata in kind. And so that's that section of Plato's Republic. Here we go with, there seemed to be a confusion and false equivocation of wider good and law justice. Essentially, there's a part where they're trying to figure out what justice is. Someone says, what the powerful says it is, what the aristocracy decide is, what was it to be enforced or not. And practically that's sort of true. I'm getting distracted. Practically, that's pretty much true. But the rebuttal kind of posed is that, what if they do say something wrong by consideration of the, would you say that was just that they did that? They told you to do something evil or something. And so then that collides with wider good. And then he's like, well, I would not consider that just. So obviously what the aristocracy say is justice is not justice because I didn't like it, essentially. Or pretty much everyone would agree that they wouldn't like it. And so there's this false dichotomy brought up that is also a sense of justice. And so law justice can't be true justice, can't be considered justice, because it goes against the intuitions of the people. But I would definitely say that just means they're two different things. Anyway. And so this is also bringing up that the noble lie brings up a king knowing the noble lie, and through the understanding that they're going to have, by also having the understanding of forms that Plato has, that there is a saying that, that king won't be considered a tyrant because a tyrant is a different category. Our one is for the people, essentially. But I don't really see that true if they believe the noble lie in the forms. For one, they're the philosopher king. And so with understanding of the forms, they actually see reality more true than anyone below them, essentially. That's why they put on the top rung, is because, they're considered to be able to see the true form that things present. And that's through the forms sort of idea is proved through Plato's cave. People are put in a cave, seeing shadows, and that's all they've known their whole life. They think it's real. And, one gets released and sees the truth of the people casting the shadows. And so he kind of makes this idea that there might be, another layer above, the trueness of beauty and stuff, which is, sort of true, but kind of not. Actually, that's something I really wanted to get into. The limits of the trueness of forms, because it is true, it is not also. It depends on the way. And, that essentially is supposed to be a parallel to say, the iron people can only see the echoes that we see on Earth, and the silver and the gold, the noble king, will see the true nature of things. And so obviously no better than the people in the iron group. And so will make decisions based on no experience, essentially. Is that he can think about something, find the true way it works, and so that's why I say the noble lie king is false, essentially, because it is built within the understanding given that believing the forms will mean, and the ability and the way that they were divided out, no matter if they believe the noble lie or not, they will believe they understand the world the most, even more than the people with more experience in a certain area. Sorry. Ugh. And so the noble king, I would say, would tend towards tyranny. Because they essentially believe themselves to be more true than anyone else and be able to see so. Anyway, so that's sort of a combination of the things that I've seen in Plato's Republic. and touched on this positive negative rights thing. Now, I did last stream talk about positive rights, and sort of positive rights does not breed incentives, essentially. And that's the huge advantage of negative rights plus privileges. Plus, it does have a division in sort of the qualifications. So we might say it is, a privilege in a society to have internet, but you have to earn your privileges. So you have to, get enough money to pay for your internet service fees and stuff like that. And so with that, that is divided from the negative rights of not being killed or something like that. Negative rights being the rights of infringement, essentially, that you have the right to not be infringed upon in certain ways. And so that division is important, because if you say they are the same, then the government or the systems above you have to maintain the services provided in order to keep your rights. Which is the positive rights case, if we're saying those are the same, is that everything is positive rights. You are given the right to internet. You're given the right to not be killed, essentially. And this false equivocation also means that taking away those rights is also, infringing you is the same as not providing something. Becomes the same as choosing to no longer be able to provide, essentially, something extra to your life. Like internet services being a privilege, if you don't pay, you don't get them. But the right to not be imprisoned without just cause can't just be taken away from you in the same way. And positive rights kind of lumps them into the same category. So why can you take away some but not others? It brings this closer to a point of danger of what is the purview of the government, where we have this negative rights case where we can say it is the role of the government to maintain negative rights, and if they provide privileges, have responsibilities with them. But in the positive rights case, you could even say there's a responsibility in order to make sure you're not imprisoned unfairly, which, there's a line there, because you could say there's a responsibility to be free in a way of, you're not a detriment to those around you. But the right to a fair trial is different. Everyone has the right to that, even if they treat others unfairly. And so there's an important line there that we can't equate those two, that, someone is seen maybe, or inferred to have done something super unfair, that we don't strip away the whole rights of fairness from them, or super evil or something like that. If they're seen to have done something, we don't strip away the fairness of a trial, or to see if they have or not. Yeah, and so that's that category. Now, last time I started talking into this sort of section of talking. And this is sort of a meta descriptive look at the ways in which the different ways in which we talk about things, especially in this sort of format where we're trying to discuss and stuff like that. where we have description, essentially, and now we could be describing something hypothetical or real, and so we might be talking about a concept. Now that concept could be something more real, it could be something we could be talking about it shallow wise, and that's actually something I want to. No, I don't think I can. Anyway, we can be talking about it in a way really shallowly. So we could be talking about the concept of love, essentially, or something like that, and we could be just talking about love. But that's that could be talking about something real, but it might not. It might be considered shallow because you're not talking about it integrated with the other sort of values or stuff that can compete with that. You know, describing as something real and integrated would be something, you know, something that happens to you, something that is concrete, you know, practical and more real. Hey. Anyway, or you could be describing something that's fake and real. So you could be, you know, gossiping about something that never happened. And so the real is really talking about something that's actually happening or not, essentially. Or might happen. It could be. No, it would be hypothetical. So something that has happened or that essentially has happened, because you can't really talk about something that is happening, essentially. And I guess you can in a real way. You could be describing your actions as you're teaching someone. And so that would be quite real, you know, as long as you don't get ahead of yourself and, you know, prove yourself wrong. So then the other category here from description, you've got real and hypothetical. Now you could be talking about a proposed sort of idea of the future or idea in general. So the hypothetical could be idealized. So it could be, you know, in the same way, kind of shallow, that hypothetically we could live in a perfect world where nobody thinks of hurting each other, and you get food just pops into our hands and we eat it. You know, I'm describing something there. It's hypothetical, but it's really idealized. There's not really any way that can manifest anyway. Truly, it is a description of something, but the idea that it could probably happen is quite idealized, while it's not integrated with, you know, sort of realities of matter, essentially, or the differences between people, essentially, and circumstances that result in, you know, people wanting to hurt each other, essentially, or accidentally hurting each other, even. Now, we've got the description of the hypothetically integrated. So we could be talking about, well, depending how long the stream goes, I'm probably gonna be hungry afterwards, and so I might grab something to eat. I've got some prepared food in the cupboard. I'll probably just heat that up in the fridge. I'll probably just heat that up. Now that's quite integrated with all these concepts out there and things that, so it's sort of solidified in and integrated within the reality around us. Now, we could be describing something hypothetical and false, like I could be describing that after the stream, I'm probably going to go to a shop and buy something. I'm most definitely not, unless I forget about the food in the fridge and I, you know, want to spend money to get some food. But I could say I'm going to buy a blanket after work. I'm not going to buy a blanket after work. I'm just telling you that now. So that is something hypothetical and false. It's something about the future, so it's hypothetical, but it's not going to happen. Now, I could also be more extreme with that. I could be And now this is where it's interesting that false could be idealized and integrated, maybe. We could consider that false could be considered, me buying a blanket isn't out of the realm of integration within reality. But saying, after this, I'm going to fly through my ceiling, not damaging it all, and start floating in the air, patrolling my city for crime. That's rather idealized, not really integrated. Sorry. So that is something interesting. In addition to have here, does that mean what comes first, the trueness or the nature of its integration? Well, can you have something true idealized? Not really. It's only integrated things. Can idealized be true? I gave a definition of idealized false just before. But can you have idealized true? Well, if idealized is the opposite from integrated, no. Where it's interesting. So I picked shallow here because it's still within the real, so it's something, not considering all the integration. Now, idealized here is something not integrated at all, essentially. Maybe, I guess you could say it is integrated in some ways. So, like, the idea of flying in the air is something integrated with concepts that exist, essentially. Like Superman, he flies through the air. So it's integrated within that sort of concept. So it is in the same way as shallow, essentially. Now, but in all sorts of ways, idealized is never full enough to ever become true, I think is probably the consideration. So do we say that it is false? Well, here's the interesting thing. If we say description, if we're trying to equate these, which we kind of just did, if we say that it is always false, then we're kind of saying that there's no value to it, which I don't think is true. A shallow description of the real is still informative. So if we were to say instead the description of a shallow integration of the real isn't false, but it is let's go with the hypothetical. An idealized hypothetical description might not be false, but it would be well, it's lacking. It is still informative, I guess. It can be informative, you can say. No. It's interesting. It's not the same as an integrated falsity, essentially, though. So I think I might just question mark that for now. So I'm going to move this down to now. This is an interesting factor of it seems as though a lot of this in all ways can be comedic, essentially. Like even an integrated falsehood could be comedic to consider. Like after this, I could drive to another city, 4 hours away and back. It's something I could do. It is integrated. I have a vehicle and can drive. And the availability of driving there is possible, but the possibility of doing so is not. I am not going to do that. That something absurd considerations is something that could be comedic, essentially. The breaking of expectations and stuff like that. Anyway. And, you can always do something ridiculous, so that might be quite integrated and true. Real, integrated and true. And comedic. Anyway. So that is the description factors. Now, apart from describing, which doesn't really have any sort of judgment essentially to it, there's the area of, possible judgment factors. And so you can say something that is either a mandate or a preference in a judgment factor. Now, what do you mean by mandated, or what do you mean by preference? Like in a way, you might prefer that, just I do something, or a group of people. I would prefer if everyone thought this, essentially. Like Plato with his noble lie, essentially, he would prefer that he has a preference that the culture would believe that, essentially. Because he's not really like laying it down as a law, essentially. He's not saying all people must say this. It's we should tell people this and it would benefit society, which it doesn't. But and so preferences are both individual and cultural. Like you can prefer that a whole lot of people prefer this, or just it's just a preference that you have, like your favorite flavor of ice cream. It can be beneficial that you're the only one in a group that has that preference, because you would get all that ice cream. Now, if you were to talk about a mandate, it could be either cultural or systematic. There are ways in which cultures can mandate stuff, like exclusion from the group and stuff like that. Now, this kind of brings up to mind, I was thinking about where to put a business. Is a business a culture or a system? Well, probably more a system, with the ways in which it can exclude people. Hey. And but the culture within the business is can mandate things by social exclusion and stuff like that. And so that's interesting. And now it's one thing that's important is to acknowledge is that the mandate in a cultural system is enforced by individuals. There isn't some sort of floating cloud that embodies the system or the culture that enforces these things. It's the individuals buying into that system or culture. And so that's something to remember, that they probably at least have to acknowledge the mandate or the preference, or share the preference essentially, or see that it is good at least, to enforce it. And so that's where we are at the moment. Now there's a sub point down here that, well, in the Platist Republic, there is the false equivocation again of justice and skill even being in the same, exclusionary categories, essentially. Like, it is said that if you're going to go buy a horse, would you rather have a just person helping you with information and buying the horse, or would you rather have someone who knows a lot of things about horses? And it's like, well, obviously you need to have the person with the skill of knowing about horses. And so this is obviously a false equivocation, because if the person that was skilled that you're using for assistance is not just, they might screw you over. You want them to be both skilled and just. So that is a different category that you do still want. And so it's kind of interesting to point out that Plato is kind of talking about a skill level there, that someone knowing stuff, not having the ability to learn, is essentially what he's talking about. Which is kind of interesting when this noble lie is kind of built upon that preface, that the people with essentially high IQs should be ruling things, and the ones that can think abstractly and philosophize. But, down here, he's saying the useful people are really the ones who, they may or may not be high IQ, but they do have a pool of skill. And so that kind of disproves the Philosopher King kind of forms sort of statement, that, just because the Philosopher King is smart and can, think deeply on things, doesn't mean he's better than someone who actually knows things about things. Like, would you prefer, let's do the same sort of equivocation, which is probably more on the field. Would you rather have a smart person who didn't know anything about horses helping you trying to buy a horse, or someone who has a lot of experience in horses and buying horses and the experience in doing so? Like, obviously you're going to want someone experienced. Someone smart doesn't know the average, someone smart doesn't know the average price in a market for something. Like, what are you talking about? Like, I've been thinking about renovating my house, and so what is the price to paint a room? How would I go about knowing that? I would have to get quotes from people, from businesses, but they could all be scamming me. I don't know. I could have picked the 3 worst ones. Like, I would have to have someone who's, been around, shopped around, and maybe bought or does paint houses, and actually have someone just actually that's going to tell me the truth about, good pricing and stuff like that, and quality, that is a trade-off. So all those things are in the skilled sector as opposed to someone smart. I'm not going to, pick, my father's friend who was a professor and go to him and ask him about, how's the market on house painting going? That's just kind of ridiculous. Now, it occurs to me that I do not know how, if I'm actually producing sound. So, okay, sweet, I am. Cool. Satisfactory. And so this is something that maybe I shouldn't go into the proofs, but talk about how prevalent, the different strata of this information is. Prevalent, let's say. Like, first, talk about the management entity structure. See, in a sort of modern times, there is the idea that the individual is kind of at the mercy of the other forces, that an individual is both at the mercy of materials like drugs or something that they've taken, the system of the government that sort of the laws that they have to follow, the culture around them, what's sort of expected of them, and they're at this mercy. They are weak and cannot ever see themselves achieve what they would want to, or sort of live in their freedom due to these other forces. Now, that is in a way true, that you aren't free to do whatever the hell you want. Even without any of these things, there is a concept that pain is the truest teacher, that no matter if you have no culture, no government, nothing around you, if you do something and receive pain, you're not going to like that. Is quite often the trueness. Now, there are obviously some exceptions, but in the general sense, if action provides pain, you're going to try to avoid it. And so, in that sense, we can see stuff that should not be, is, without culture, system, or, influencing material, well, we can see the stuff that we, as an individual, would not prefer. We would prefer not to be hurt. It's quite easy to see. We would prefer. So with that, we would probably want repercussions to whatever hurt us. Now, because if, me receiving pain, prevents an action, would prevent me from trying to repeat an action, me causing pain, and them wanting to stop that pain by maybe hurting me, would be the same thing, essentially. If I cause an action that in its reaction hurt me, that's the same as me hurting someone else and them, not being happy about that and reacting and hurting me. And so with that, we see that individuals essentially, create this base moral framework that, for one, when I'm hurt for something that I think is good, I would want to, prevent that from happening again, or, just unfairly. And so that's why the key virtue of individual is fairness. That if we do something good, we expect not to be hurt for it. And also, if we do nothing, we don't expect, well, not nothing, but, haven't been warned or are being passive, we expect not to be hurt for it. And so the worst sort of also anti-virtue is manipulation, where essentially the other sort of thing is the case, where we provide essentially false, not pains, but pleasures, essentially unrewarded pleasures in order to get what we want, essentially. It's more a pushing sort of guidance. And so with that, we can see that the individual kind of has preferences and would want that mandated and would essentially make a culture and a system or system, we could maybe see it one way or the other. Probably a system. But anyway, we can see that the individual makes those things essentially through just wanting fairness and wanting to achieve essentially whatever it is. We are not islands. We need to eat. We need something to be provided for us to live or continue living. So where does that put us? That means essentially at the base level, there was responsibility to the individual, essentially. And that sort of same sort of wider good of, people understanding each other's, they don't want to be caused pain or whatever. Or unjustly caused pain, and other people would disagree with the unjust causing of pain because they empathize with that. But a just causing of pain, they could see the negative action which they want to discourage. And so with that, we can see this sort of negative rights model form in sort of the entities of just the individual. And we can see responsibility being given to individuals in order to not cause pain to each other. Now, why would... And so now, and that's quite the negative rights, then, the culture and systems provide luxuries in the sort of other people providing what you need to survive in this sort of no man is an island way. And so if we think about the positive rights model, it is the responsibility. It ignores that, essentially. It ignores the individual. It ignores the individual responsibility there and says it was the system that pushed them in that direction. Now, it is fair to say that the individual case that I brought forward before is maybe a hypothetical integrated falsity, because it wasn't real, or a hypothetical integrated. Now, this is interesting. What is a postulation along these descriptive lines? I'm not talking about a preference. I'm not talking about mandate. It's a description. But that description wasn't real. So this is what I'm trying to talk about. The sort of systems, a individual stripped down from systems, culture, and material influences never happened. So it's hypothetical. Is it idealized? In a way, yes. It's not integrated with reality. It's sort of abstracted because, it's not talking about a current future, essentially. It's talking about a hypothetical or a sort of abstracted description. So that can actually provide our answer here. So if a hypothetical could be... Now, did I put that into real before? Like, I was talking about beauty, just talking about beauty being real. So let's just put abstracted down here. You can move it later. Anyway, there's this consideration that, at no point in history was an individual just an individual. And that, all through existence, if you, both believe in evolution or not, the individual was was with people and had to consider that. Hey, what do you want? Anyway, but it's an interesting sort of case subject. Someone might, or that is sort of the psychological sort of impact of certain actions. That if action provides negative impact, then you're enough, or totally. Not totally, but like collective negative impact, that you're probably not going to redo it unless there's some little bit of positive in there that it's worth the negative, essentially. Now, where were we? So we're talking about the rights with that. So if we were to we could say that positive rights neglects that sort of personal responsibility of like not hurting each other, essentially. And so that's kind of where culture is kind of pushed with this, easy on crime or something like that, is that, culture, material, and systems are the ones to blame. That the individual doesn't have responsibility for their actions, then there was no rights implying that they had to act fairly or whatever. There was no right to not infringe upon the other individuals. And there was a conceptualization that the individual would never hurt another person, essentially, that the individual can have no responsibility because it was these things that had the responsibility for their actions. Which, are you saying that this is actually a good point for a quote from a movie I watched recently. And, this is sort of the, brings up the Christian conceptualization that brought up rights in general, that, these things were not considered to people before, sort of Christian contextualization that in England and France. But they, French brought up the positive rights, the English brought up the negative rights. So I'll bring up this quote. Unfortunately, I can't, give it to you. So there's sort of this parallel being brought forward of a chessboard. And so this movie was The Kingdom of Heaven. And so the main character, Orlando Bloom, has been recently just given the position of a knight, essentially. I think so. His father has revealed to him after he's grown up and his wife has just died, and his father, who he never knew, reveals himself to be a knight who abused his mum, and so there's a bit of tension there, but he essentially gets into Jerusalem where the king is, and the king is, actually I might go back a little bit. The king asks, they meet over a chessboard, and the king presents the idea that the whole world is in chess. Any move can be the death of you. You do anything except remain where you started, and you cannot be sure of the end. Uh, and then he asks, were you ever sure of your end? He thought he was going to, live his whole life in that town, and die there. And now he's before a king, and so that sort of in the story kind of posed in itself as not you can never be sure of your end, and all of us can see in our own lives we don't know where we're going to end up. Now, skipping a little bit, we can. There's the king also mentions a king can move a man, a father may claim a son, but that man can also move himself, and only then does he truly begin his own game. And so that's quite interesting. We all sort of begin in our parent's shadow, essentially, and that's sort of brought up in this sort of model that the culture and the systems and the material all sort of influence the individuals as we grow up. But is that you don't, then you're not truly playing your own game. You're living at the mercy of these other sort of factors, and you're not choosing your life in itself. And anyone who's grown up has had to make their own choices in their life, whether to stay at a job, whether to go to and to go to your first job, where to go, and all these sort of factors. Relationship factors of who's your friends, who's your special someone, and committing to that person, and sort of willing to give up your own sort of your personal freedom, your essentially positive rights or privileges that you have, are those worth sacrificing for these new sort of positive rights of a relationship. And that's sort of a conceptualization that happens quite a lot, and that's sort of epitomized in these sort of positive negative rights is the division between the right to not be infringed on and the right to essentially freedom, air quotes, from any sort of imposition upon you, in the sort of negative rights sense, that you couldn't take it too far and say nobody has the right to make me do anything. And I don't think negative rights sort of push that far. And so, if you have that position, then there is no benefit in a relation. Well, you're going to have to confront that if you want to, have an integrated relationship with another person. And so, yeah, where were we? And so this is the sort of thing of once you playing your own game means that you're going to have to take responsibility for yourself. You're going to have to be an individual and claim responsibility for that. Now, that it could be something that scares you, and so why you might not want to do that and rely on these systems to push you around. So the quote continues from the king. Remember that whosoever you are played or by whom, but remember, howsoever you are played or by whom, your soul is in your keeping alone, even though those who presume to play you be kings or powerful men. When you stand before God, you cannot say, but I was told by others to do this, or that virtue was not convenient at the time. This will not suffice. Remember that. And so this is sort of the, pushing back against that sort of impulse of saying, well, all these forces are upon me, and so I shall not take responsibility for my life. Well, in life, we have seen that people that rely on these systems aren't covered by them. We've seen a lot of maybe through stories and but through truity, someone who was just following the systems and doing what they thought, what they were being told, quite often become the fall guy, the scapegoat, um, and are still punished because they didn't do what was right in themselves. These days, quite often the opposite is true, that someone, took on individual responsibility, did not accomplish it well, and should have followed the systems to protect themselves. And that's a whole lot of insurance and policy sort of basis. But with managers and business fronts, you can, doesn't matter how well you follow the systems, your business can still fail. Or in high government, you can do all the right things, but the people can all the right things according to the systems. You can, and in that sense, when you're creating the system, you're responsible. Now, down to the individual, the sort of more collectivist, or sort of so there's a few systems that can are in themselves not sufficient, like appliance testing. This is might be a bit of a quite switching into described, real, integrated, but all appliances and businesses and supposedly homes are meant to be tested and proved to be fit for use. Hey, what's up? Oh, you're getting feisty. Should I just stop petting you? No. Anyway, so appliances need to be tested. So it's interesting to think that essentially this is a system to remove the individual responsibility, that you had it tested and so it is safe, but that doesn't prevent an individual picking up appliance from it being faulty. A appliance may be tested and proven safe for use a month ago, but the person before you using it might have damaged it, and you using it without inspecting it actually is putting yourself at risk, and also doesn't protect that tag. Never prevented that the person before you who damaged it from any sort of responsibility. They can be seen as acting unfit, and if there's so many different ways in which that can all go wrong, that the business, they got test tagged yesterday, let's say, and it was went all wrong, that the business might scapegoat the individual, being, well, they didn't do it right, and throw them under the bus for that. Like, it's interesting that quite often happens more in management, and that's kind of owning of that sort of individual responsibility when you are part of the system, essentially. And it's almost harder to find a individual responsibility that is within a system that the individual gets responsible for. And so that's probably the quite an idea of the sort of moral system that we have. And so that's probably the sort of responsibilities and privileges that are put upon us. Anyway, I've gone way off track. And, well, let's put it this way. The responsibility might not put on you from a justice perspective, but it will probably be put on you for a wider good perspective. That, say you used an equipment bad and ended up hurting someone, there is definitely going to be social impacts and negative feelings about you. And in this way, laws can never protect you from that. The judgment of those around you, it doesn't matter if someone told you. It doesn't matter if, the system or the culture told you to do something, even if you did that and other people thought that was wrong, like, let's say, snitching. Within a business, even, like, there's quite a few ways in which, admitting, pulling someone up on something they've done wrong according to the mandate of the system is seen as a wider good bad. And if you were to do that, that's correct in the system, but, you will be, socially ostracized in some ways for that. And so that's interesting to consider. And there's probably ways in the opposite is true, that following the culture and the systems, you might fire a bunch of people, that, the profits are down, your upper management tell you have to fire people. People are going to look down on you for that and really not like you for doing that. Now, I've heard of times when, a manager has actually just said no, and quite a lot of positive sort of moral virtue is being bestowed on them in the eyes of others for doing that. And so that's something to consider, is that I guess it comes back to here, is the other people's perception of your fairness, of the individual's fairness, is an important thing to each other. And it doesn't matter if it's a cultural or systematic mandate. It is important to others whether you did what is right. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter how, much you had on the line for it, if it, hurt others and was unfair to them. And so that's sort of something that can be seen as reflected in, the King's comments in the movie that I was talking about. That it doesn't matter. Let's read that again. Remember that howsoever you are played, or by whom, your soul is in your keeping alone. Even though those who presume to play you be kings or powerful men. That, we could swap out your soul as your standing. Your standing is yours alone among people. Your family might even start looking down upon you for, actions that you were just doing what you were told, or, and so the easy sort of comparison is, the Nazis, is that, they were told as a mandate of a system to do so many horrific things, or even just wartime in itself. It doesn't matter what side you're on. You might be told to do awful things. And you will hold the responsibility of essentially your standing. And so that's something to think about. And so that is some way, even if the system, culture, and material systematically, sort of the thing that gets blamed for your actions, your individual wider good standing will be impacted. will be you'll face punishment in that sense. Hey, you go down. Anyway, so that's something interesting to think about. Is with the individual being fairness being considered the virtue, then the wider good, as opposed to the law, is sort of the impact of the virtue of that person being seen. Now, there's sort of fairness is doing some hard yards there, and what we are chucking into it as meaning, in its meaning of, how much, the sort of scope of the areas of which it's impacting. So that's kind of where we were. Now I was going to do some proofs. I find it interesting that as I keep working the circle, I find more areas like the abstracted. And I find that I think I've been doing more proofs as I've been doing that as well. Like as I was talking about with different examples of sort of work or government responsibility being given to the individual, And essentially, I guess it's yeah. I keep thinking about areas in which corruption are involved. That the culture within the system is letting some of these system elements go, essentially, like police sort of corruption, and then it's interesting that usually an individual is punished in the end of it. That we can never really, and quite often scapegoated for that material, like that whole thing. And we can see that also in like governments essentially as well. That if like the Ministry of Health, if there's seen to be corruption within there, if that reaches them, they're usually the one that takes the brunt of the force, and we don't really talk about anyone else involved. Now, this was the length of my first stream, and as I was reiterating the last two. And so I'm pretty happy with that. I think I should probably get into some extra points at least next time. Now, I did have some points noted down. Now, do I have any in photos? See, at work, I quite often write things on my hands and take a photo of it. Now, that was no, there's nothing new there, and I did take a note of something. I'm not sure if there's a concept in sort of writing of sort of actionable words. Or storytelling, I should say. So the words were win, stop, escape, and retrieve. And so it'll be interesting to think about whether that's a full list, for one. And also how we can have that impact sort of the sort of psychology around things, essentially. Anyway, I think that's me for today. Thank you for watching. See you. Well, I'll probably go and eat some microwave food. Might be actually a bit later. And so that's interesting that the described real integrated might be true, but might be, to what extent. To what extent and when? I feel like these are very important questions when that are usually not asked when we were trying to, start a dialogue, or try to get on the same page, essentially. Yeah. Okay. We might talk about those 3 points, those 2 questions, and the 4 actions next time. See you.